Good evening, gentlemen. I was going to say ladies and gentlemen, but this is an all-male group tonight, so I hope no female organization gets after us. It just turned out that way, and no male bias is intended. Again, we're going to be on my favorite subject, psychology, so let's get right to work on the first question.
Mr. Branden, do you regard neurosis as always indicative of some underlying immorality?
Emphatically, I do not. I am quite convinced that a young child can begin to develop what amounts to neurotic defenses without any question of immorality being involved. In a situation where the young child is exposed to great amounts of terror or pain at the hands of his elders that he is quite unequipped to deal with, and so far as the young child is concerned, and within the context of the young child's knowledge, in the interest of survival, a process of blocking and repression can get set up, can get started, which, to repeat, within the context of the young child's knowledge, cannot possibly be described as willfully irrational. And yet that repression works its way within the young child's mind and can result in institutionalized types of mental blocks that will have a certain obstructing effect upon the child's subsequent thinking or range of awareness, such that a neurotic structure to some extent can be said to exist, and yet I don't think it would be remotely reasonable to say that immorality was involved in this case. This is a question I'm asked very often. I regret the fact that I didn't make this point clearer in The Psychology of Self-Esteem. It's not my view that neurosis or the presence of psychological problems necessarily has to reflect underlying immorality. You see, what makes this issue a bit tricky is the fact that almost everybody is mentally dishonest at one time or another about something or another. And that alone can make us tempted to assume that if that's true, why then it must have been such a dishonesty that generated the initial childhood process of repression and mental blocking that started him off into his troubles. That's not a justifiable inference. Now, as I said in The Psychology of Self-Esteem, there often is some degree of complicity on the child's part. But I regret that I didn't take sufficient cognizance of and devote more space to those instances where I don't believe it's fair or valid to accuse the child of complicity, and yet where some degree of neurosis does develop. In objectivity, I don't want to imply that the issue was perfectly clear to me then, but by an oversight I didn't make it clear in the book. The truth is, the issue wasn't as clear to me at the time of writing the book as it since has become. And perhaps at some point in the future I'll issue a second edition of the book and go into this issue in more detail theoretically and spell out my views more carefully, or if not there, then in some other future piece of writing, because this is an issue which I'd like to discuss much more detailedly than I can do here.
Mr. Branden, does the existence of such a phenomenon as repression make it especially difficult at times to judge whether or not an action is immoral?
To a certain extent, yes. You see, when we are wondering whether or not to hold a person morally responsible for some piece of behavior which we regard by our moral standards as objectively wrong or unjust or whatever, we are always concerned with the question, did he know what he was doing? Did the person know that it was wrong? Could he have known better? Could he have done better? Etc. And repression is obviously a relevant question, at least in some cases, to wonder about, because we know that certain types of repression can obstruct the clarity of thinking, can obstruct the clarity of judgment, can restrict the field of awareness, and cause a person to fail to see certain facts that otherwise would be accessible to him. However, let's not make too much of this, because this is not relevant with regard to gross, so-called common sense crimes such as theft or murder or physical violence. It applies to much subtler issues in human relationships, perhaps incidences of unintended cruelty, or hurting a person through blindness, where one has really behaved badly, but it may not in fact be an instance of immorality in a technical sense at all, but the fact that repression had so muddled up one's thinking in this area that one couldn't see straight or think straight. So I don't think that repression constitutes a problem with regard to gross moral crimes. I see no evidence to support the notion that it does, but it can have a relevant place in determining subtler issues of a person's misbehavior or wrong behavior. However, there's a very important principle or thought that I'd like to leave with you on this subject. When we are judging a person's behavior, I'm so often asked by clients or patients or friends, did I think the person was conscious of what he was doing when the person did something that clearly is wrong, unjust, immoral, or whatever? And my attitude is the following. This may sound a bit strange at first. That question is only interesting to me or relevant if we are discussing a person who usually does try to be aware of what he is doing, does try to be conscious of what he is doing, so that if he this time is not aware, it is truly an exception. But if we are talking about a person who, as a matter of principle, takes pains never to be conscious of what he is doing, never to be aware, not to identify the meaning, implications, and consequences of his actions, then it becomes quite beside the point to say, but he didn't realize what he was doing, because it's not his policy to know what he's doing, as a matter of general attitude, you see. So I do condemn him, even though he may not have known, or may not have known fully what he was doing in a particular case, because we can be entitled to say, he should have made it his business to know what he was doing. To say I didn't think is not an excuse, or is not necessarily an excuse. It can only be an excuse if one can truly say, I saw no necessity for fresh thinking on that subject. I thought the issue was entirely clear to me, but I made a mistake. You see, but omitting an instance of that kind, we have to be expected to think, we have to expect of ourselves and others that we will take pains to be conscious. So to repeat, if I am inquiring about a person who I know generally does try to know what he's doing, is conscientious in that way, why then if I learn in a particular instance that he didn't know, I can believe it, I can accept it, and it changes my moral evaluation of an action which in objective terms I can describe as wrong. But if it's a person who never knows what he's doing, loosely speaking, of course I don't mean that literally, because everyone knows what he's doing at least some of the time, but you all know what I mean. Generally speaking, a person who behaves unthinkingly and irresponsibly, why then for such a person it's no defense at all to say that he did not know what he was doing, or that he wasn't aware, or that he wasn't conscious in a particular instance. And that's a very important practical principle to remember in judging people, I think.
Would it be possible to dispense with the concept of the unconscious or the subconscious, as some psychologists advocate?
No, it would not be possible, in my judgment, to dispense with the concept of the unconscious or the subconscious. Subconscious is the term I prefer to use. And those psychologists who attempt to dispense with it usually end up using some disguised synonym. The fact remains there are mental processes, there are mental calculations that take place subverbally and beneath the level of conscious awareness?